Logan had been job hunting for nearly a year, with countless interviews that went nowhere and sleepless nights spent wondering if his luck would ever change. When the offer letter finally arrived, it felt like a miracle. The company, a large firm specializing in building management systems, offered him a role as a night shift engineer, overseeing the maintenance of 3 interconnected high-rise buildings. The job required him to relocate to a new city, but they sweetened the deal with company-provided accommodation. It was a chance to start fresh, and Logan eagerly accepted. The company's provided apartment was modest but comfortable, just a short walk from the control room where he would be stationed each night. The first week of training went smoothly. Logan was paired with an experienced engineer named Mark, who showed him the ropes during the day shift. Mark was friendly, patient, and thorough, ensuring Logan understood every detail of the job. He explained how the building management system controlled everything from lighting, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning to fire safety and security systems across the 3 buildings. The control room, where Logan would spend most of his time, was a small, dimly lit space filled with screens displaying real-time data from the buildings. Logan's role seemed straightforward enough. He'd monitor the system from the control room, addressing any alarms or issues that arose. If something went wrong, like a sensor malfunction or a power surge, he'd either fix it remotely or head into the building to resolve the issue in person. It was a solitary job, but Logan didn't mind. He liked the idea of working quietly through the night, the city asleep around him. After completing his week of day shift training, Logan was ready for his first solo night shift. As he walked to the control room, the streets were eerily quiet, the city bathed in the pale glow of streetlights. The buildings loomed above him, their windows darkened except for the occasional flicker of light. Inside the control room, everything was as he remembered, calm, almost soothing in its quiet hum of machines and the soft glow of the monitors. The first few nights passed without incident. Logan grew comfortable in his routine, appreciating the solitude and the predictability of the job. But then, on the 4th night, something strange happened. It was just after midnight when an alert flashed on one of the screens. Sensor malfunction on the 13th floor of Building 3. Logan frowned at the monitor. The 13th floor was a maintenance floor, rarely used and mostly filled with storage and equipment rooms. He tried to reset the sensor remotely, but the system wasn't responding. Logan grabbed his toolkit and flashlight, trying to ignore the unease settling in his stomach. He'd been trained for this, after all. It was probably just a faulty wire or a loose connection. Still, as he exited the control room and made his way to Building 3, a chill ran down his spine. The corridors were silent, his footsteps echoing as he walked. The elevator ride felt interminable, the numbers on the display creeping upwards until it finally stopped on the 13th floor. The doors slid open with a ding, revealing a dimly lit hallway that seemed to stretch on forever. The air was thick with dust, and the fluorescent lights above flickered intermittently, casting long, unsettling shadows. Logan stepped out of the elevator, his heartbeat quickening as he scanned the corridor. The sensor was located near the end of the hall, outside a storage room. He walked slowly, the sound of his own breathing unnervingly loud in the silence. When he reached the sensor, it looked perfectly fine, no obvious damage, nothing that should have caused it to malfunction. Logan opened his toolkit and started to inspect it, his hand steady despite the anxiety gnawing at him. As he worked, a strange sensation crept over him, a feeling like he was being watched. He paused, glancing over his shoulder down the empty hallway. There was nothing there, but the feeling persisted, prickling at the back of his neck. Logan shook his head, trying to dispel the unease. He was just letting the isolation get to him. After all, he was alone in the building. He turned back to the sensor, But just as he was about to replace it, the lights above him flickered violently before going out completely, plunging the corridor into darkness. Logan's heart leaped into his throat. He fumbled for his flashlight, the beam cutting through the blackness. He swung it around, illuminating the hallway, the storage room door, and the elevator at the far end. Everything was as it should be, empty, quiet. But then, a sound echoed through the hall, faint but unmistakable, the creak of a door hinge. Logan's breath caught in his chest. He swung the flashlight back towards the storage room door, now slightly ajar. It had been closed when he arrived. He was sure of it. He took a step back, his mind racing. Maybe the door had just drifted open, a result of old hinges and the building's ventilation. But the rational explanation did little to calm his rising panic. He approached the door cautiously, his flashlight beam trembling as he reached out to push it open further. The door creaked louder as it swung inward, revealing a dark, cramped room filled with dusty shelves and old equipment. Logan swept the flashlight across the room, his pulse pounding in his ears. The room was empty, no signs of movement, nothing out of place. Logan exhaled slowly, trying to steady his nerves. He was about to close the door when something caught his eye. A figure, just at the edge of the flashlight's beam, standing motionless in the far corner of the room. Logan froze, the light trembling as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. The figure was barely visible, shrouded in darkness, but he could make out the faint outline of a person. His mind raced, 1,000 explanations flashing through his head. An intruder, a trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by fatigue. But before he could react, the figure moved, stepping forward into the light. It was a man, his face obscured by shadow, but something was wrong, terribly wrong. His movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet being manipulated by unseen strings. Logan's breath caught in his throat as the man took another step forward, his face finally coming into view. It was pale, almost deathly white, with hollow, sunken eyes that stared directly at Logan. A twisted, unnatural grin spread across the man's face, his lips curling into a grotesque smile. Logan stumbled back, his heart hammering in his chest. The flashlight slipped from his grasp, clattering to the floor as he turned and bolted down the hallway. He could hear footsteps behind him, heavy and uneven, echoing in the dark. The elevator was still at the end of the hall, its doors closed. He slammed the button repeatedly, glancing over his shoulder as the footsteps grew louder, closer. The elevator doors slid open just as the figure reached the end of the hall. Logan threw himself inside, frantically pressing the button for the ground floor. The doors closed slowly, agonizingly slowly, and for a brief, terrifying moment, he saw the man's face again. Closer this time, inches from the elevator, that same twisted grin etched into his features. The doors finally shut, and the elevator lurched into motion, descending rapidly. Logan's entire body was trembling, cold sweat dripping down his face. He pressed himself against the wall, trying to calm his racing heart. It had to be a nightmare, some kind of stress-induced hallucination. But it felt so real, too real. When the elevator reached the ground floor, Logan practically fell out of it, stumbling into the lobby. It was empty, silent, the usual night shift security guard nowhere to be seen. Logan didn't care. He sprinted out of the building, gasping for breath as the cool night air hit his face. He didn't stop running until he reached the control room. Inside, everything was normal. The monitors were glowing softly, the system quietly humming along. Logan slammed the door behind him, locking it and collapsing into the chair at the desk. He stared at the monitors, his mind racing, trying to process what had just happened. As he sat there, trembling, a new alert flashed on one of the screens, another sensor malfunction, this time on the 13th floor of Building 2. Logan's blood ran cold. There was no way he was going back up there. No way he was going to face whatever that thing was again. He tried to reset the sensor remotely, but the system wasn't responding, just like before. Suddenly, the lights in the control room flickered, then went out, plunging him into darkness once more. Logan's breath caught in his throat as the monitors blinked off, one by one, until the room was completely dark. The only sound was his own ragged breathing, the silence pressing in on him like a weight. Then, from somewhere behind him, he heard the soft creak of a door opening. Logan turned slowly, dread pooling in his stomach. The door to the control room was still locked, but the sound persisted, a low, creaking noise, like the slow opening of an old, heavy door. It was followed by footsteps, soft and deliberate, moving closer. Logan fumbled for his flashlight, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He turned it on, the beam cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there, just the empty room. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment everything was still. Then, without warning, the flashlight flickered and went out, plunging him back into darkness. Logan felt a cold breath on the back of his neck, a presence looming behind him. He wanted to scream, to run, but his body was frozen, paralyzed by fear. Slowly, he turned his head, the darkness pressing in on him from all sides. There, inches from his face, was the man again, his hollow eyes staring into Logan's, that twisted grin still etched on his face. Logan tried to move, but his body wouldn't respond, as if some unseen force was holding him in place. The man leaned closer, his cold breath brushing against Logan's ear. "You shouldn't have come here," he whispered, his voice low and guttural. "You're not alone, Logan. You'll never be alone." Logan's vision blurred, his mind spiraling into panic. The last thing he saw before everything went black was the man's grin, stretching wider and wider, until it was all that remained. When Logan woke, he was lying on the floor of the control room, the lights flickering back on, the monitors glowing softly around him. He sat up slowly, his head pounding, his body drenched in sweat. The room was empty, no sign of the man, no sign of anything out of the ordinary. But something was different. The air felt thicker, heavier, and the room was unnervingly quiet. Logan stood up, his legs trembling, and checked the monitors. Everything was normal, no alerts, no malfunctions, nothing to indicate anything had happened. But as he turned to leave the control room, something caught his eye, a reflection in one of the darkened monitors. He looked closer, his heart skipping a beat. There, just over his shoulder, he saw the man's face, staring back at him with that same twisted grin. Logan spun around, but the room was empty. He looked back at the monitor, nothing. Just his own pale, terrified reflection staring back at him. The rest of the night passed in a blur of anxiety and dread. Logan stayed in the control room, too afraid to leave, too terrified to close his eyes. The following morning, Logan barely managed to drag himself out of bed. The night's events replayed in his mind over and over, a relentless loop of terror that left him exhausted and on edge. He had planned to quit the job immediately, pack his bags, and leave the city. But something pulled him back, an insistent need to confront his manager, to demand an explanation for what had happened. He needed to know if it was all in his head, or if there was something more sinister at play. Logan arrived at the office just as the day shift was starting. The building was bustling with activity, a stark contrast to the eerie emptiness of the night before. He made his way to the manager's office, his nerves frayed, his hands shaking. He knocked on the door, and a calm voice invited him in. Mr. Harris, the manager, was a middle-aged man with graying hair and a warm, reassuring smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He looked up from his desk as Logan entered, his expression immediately softening with concern when he saw the state Logan was in. "Logan, you look like you've seen a ghost," Mr. Harris said, gesturing for him to take a seat. "What happened?" Logan hesitated, unsure of how to begin. He couldn't just blurt out that he had been chased by a spectral figure, could he? But the need for answers overpowered his reluctance. He took a deep breath and told Mr. Harris everything: how the sensor malfunctioned, the trip to the 13th floor, the man in the storage room, and the terrifying encounter in the control room. Mr. Harris listened quietly, his expression unreadable, but there was a strange stillness in his demeanor that set Logan on edge. When Logan finished, there was a long silence, broken only by the distant hum of the building's ventilation system. "Logan," Mr. Harris finally said, his voice calm and measured, "I understand how disturbing this must have been for you. Night shifts can play tricks on the mind. When you're alone, especially in a place as large and quiet as these buildings, it's easy to start seeing things that aren't really there." Logan stared at him, disbelief flooding his mind. "You think I imagined it?" he asked, incredulity seeping into his voice. Mr. Harris leaned forward, his hands folded on the desk. "I'm not saying that you didn't experience something frightening, Logan, but these kinds of things are not uncommon for night shift workers. The isolation, the darkness, it can all lead to what you described. You're not the first one to have these kinds of experiences." Logan's heart sank. "So, you knew? You knew something like this could happen?" Mr. Harris sighed and leaned back in his chair, looking more tired than before. "Yes, we've had incidents in the past. The previous night shift engineer had a similar experience. He was convinced the buildings were haunted. He left without much explanation, just like you're thinking of doing now. That's why we brought you in." A chill ran down Logan's spine. They had known, and yet they hadn't warned him. "Why didn't you tell me?" "We didn't want to alarm you unnecessarily," Mr. Harris replied smoothly. "We believed that if you understood that it was likely just your mind playing tricks on you, you could handle it better. We were wrong, and for that, I apologize." Logan shook his head, disbelief and anger warring within him. "I'm resigning. I can't stay here, not after what happened." Mr. Harris held up a hand, his expression suddenly earnest. "Please, Logan, don't make any hasty decisions. You're a good engineer, and we don't want to lose you. I understand this has been a difficult experience, but I assure you, we'll take steps to ensure it doesn't happen again." Logan frowned, his resolve faltering. "What do you mean?" "We'll make changes," Mr. Harris said, his tone persuasive. "From now on, you won't be working the night shift alone. We're going to hire another engineer to work alongside you during the night shift. Until that person is on board, you'll work exclusively on the day shift. We'll even set a new policy. If anything happens during the night shift, the two of you will always go together. No more solo trips to the floors." Logan considered this. The idea of never having to face the darkness of those buildings alone again was tempting, and the promise of day shifts, at least for a while, was a relief. He didn't want to leave the job, he needed it, and he had worked so hard to get here. But the memory of that night still gnawed at him. "Are you sure this will help?" Logan asked, his voice tinged with doubt. Mr. Harris nodded firmly. "I'm certain. We'll make sure you're never in that situation again. Just give us a little time to bring in another engineer. I think you'll find it much easier to handle with someone else by your side." After a long moment, Logan sighed. "All right, I'll stay, but only if I'm not working nights alone." "Agreed," Mr. Harris said, a hint of relief in his voice. "Thank you, Logan. You won't regret this." For the next few days, Logan worked exclusively during the day shift. The sunlight streaming through the windows and the presence of other employees around him made it easier to forget the horrors of that night. The building felt different during the day, less oppressive, more alive. Logan's anxiety gradually began to subside, replaced by a cautious optimism that perhaps things would return to normal. A week later, the new night shift engineer arrived. His name was Jake, a tall, affable guy with a quick smile and an easygoing demeanor. He was a few years older than Logan, with a few more years of experience in the field, and Logan found himself warming to him quickly. They bonded over shared experiences in the industry, the challenges of the job, and their mutual love of movies. Jake had a way of making light of things, and his presence was a comfort to Logan. Jake's training began just as Logan's had, with Mark, who was still around for the day shifts, showing him the ins and outs of the building management system. Logan joined in on some of the sessions, making sure Jake understood the quirks of the night shift and sharing his own insights. The camaraderie between them helped to push the memories of that night further into the recesses of Logan's mind. When it came time for their first night shift together, Logan felt a nervous excitement rather than dread. The company's new policy meant that the two engineers would always stick together, ensuring that no one was ever left alone in the building during the night. Logan felt a sense of safety in numbers, believing that with Jake by his side, the night shift would be manageable, maybe even uneventful. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the city's lights flickered on, Logan and Jake settled into the control room, their first night shift together officially beginning. The building was quiet, as always, but with Jake's presence, the silence didn't seem as oppressive. They chatted casually, Jake cracking jokes to lighten the mood, and Logan found himself laughing for the first time in days. A few hours into the shift, an alert pinged on one of the monitors, a sensor malfunction on the 13th floor of Building 3. Logan's stomach tightened at the sight of it, memories of that night rushing back. But he forced himself to stay calm. He wasn't alone this time. Jake noticed Logan's hesitation and gave him a reassuring pat on the back. "Don't worry, man. We've got this. It's probably just a loose wire or something. We'll be in and out in no time." Logan nodded, grateful for Jake's confidence. They grabbed their tools and flashlights, and together they made their way to Building 3. The elevator ride was eerily familiar, but Logan felt more at ease with Jake standing beside him, cracking jokes about horror movies and haunted houses. The elevator doors opened onto the 13th floor, the same dimly lit hallway that had haunted Logan's nightmares. But this time, it felt different. The oppressive atmosphere was still there, but with Jake's presence, it seemed less terrifying, less real. They walked down the hallway together, their footsteps echoing in unison. When they reached the malfunctioning sensor, Logan's hands were steady as he inspected it. It was a simple fix, a loose connection that was easily tightened. But as he worked, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He glanced at Jake, who seemed completely at ease, his flashlight beam sweeping across the hallway. "You okay?" Jake asked, noticing Logan's unease. "Yeah, just this place gives me the creeps," Logan admitted. "Hey, you and me both," Jake said with a grin. "But we've got each other's back, right? No ghost is gonna mess with us." Logan smiled, feeling a little better. "Right, let's get this done and get out of here." As they finished the repair and started back towards the elevator, Logan couldn't help but glance over his shoulder. The hallway was empty, just as it had been before, but the memory of that twisted grin still lingered in his mind. He shook it off, reminding himself that Jake was right there with him. They were safe. The rest of the night passed without incident. They returned to the control room, where Jake immediately launched into a story about his time working in a much older, even creepier building. Logan laughed along, feeling the tension ease from his shoulders. Maybe this wouldn't be so bad after all. But as the night wore on, Logan couldn't help but feel a lingering unease. He told himself it was just residual fear from his previous experience, nothing more. After all, nothing had happened this time. There were no strange figures, no sudden power outages, no unexplained noises. Everything was fine. But deep down, a part of him couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting, lurking just beyond the edge of the light, biding its time. As the first light of dawn began to break through the horizon, Logan and Jake completed their shift, handing over to the day crew with the usual briefings. Logan felt a sense of accomplishment, even relief. The night had passed without any real incidents, and he and Jake had worked well together. Maybe, just maybe, the worst was behind him. But as they left the building and stepped into the early morning light, Logan couldn't resist one last glance back at the towering structure behind them. For just a moment, he thought he saw a shadow move behind one of the upper floor windows, just a flicker, gone in an instant. He blinked and it was gone, leaving him wondering if he had imagined it. Jake noticed him staring and clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Come on, man, let's get some breakfast. You've earned it." Logan nodded, tearing his eyes away from the building and forcing a smile. "Yeah, let's go." As they walked away, Logan couldn't help but feel that the night shift wasn't done with him yet, that whatever haunted the shadows of those buildings was still there, waiting. But with Jake by his side, he felt a little more prepared to face whatever might come next. The unease that had plagued Logan during his night shifts never fully disappeared, but with Jake by his side, he managed to push it to the back of his mind. They had settled into a rhythm, working through the nights together, sharing stories and keeping each other company. The new policy of sticking together had worked well so far. But in the back of Logan's mind, the memory of that night on the 13th floor lingered like a shadow, never fully fading. One particularly quiet night, an alert pinged on the control room monitors. It was a sensor malfunction, again on the 13th floor of Building 3. Logan's heart skipped a beat as he stared at the screen. Jake noticed his reaction and nudged him with a reassuring smile. "Come on, man, we've done this before. It's just another sensor," Jake said, his tone light, though Logan could sense the tension in his voice. They grabbed their tools and flashlights, making their way to the elevator. The ride-up was silent, the hum of the machinery the only sound. When they reached the 13th floor, the doors slid open to reveal the same dimly lit hallway that had haunted Logan's nightmares. They stepped out, their footsteps echoing ominously as they walked down the hallway toward the faulty sensor. As they reached the sensor, Logan set to work immediately, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling gnawing at the back of his mind. He focused on the task, his hands moving methodically as he tightened connections and checked readings. Just as he was about to finish, Jake suddenly turned to him. "Hey, I need to hit the restroom real quick. You good here?" Jake asked, pointing down the hall. Logan looked up, a flash of panic in his eyes. "Jake, can't you wait? I'm almost done. Let's just finish this and get out of here." Jake chuckled, trying to downplay the tension. "Come on, Logan. Don't tell me you're still scared. I'll be right back, just on the same floor. I won't be long." Logan hesitated but finally nodded, watching as Jake walked down the hallway toward the restroom. The door creaked open, and Jake disappeared inside, leaving Logan alone. The hallway seemed to grow darker, the shadows lengthening as Logan returned to his work. He tried to focus on the sensor, but his mind kept drifting to the silence around him, the oppressive weight of the building pressing down on him. Inside the restroom, Jake quickly finished up in one of the stalls, feeling a slight chill in the air. He dismissed it as nerves, chuckling to himself as he stepped out and moved to the sink to wash his hands. As he turned on the tap, he heard the door to the restroom creak shut behind him. He glanced up at the mirror, expecting to see Logan trying to sneak up on him, but the room was empty. "Nice try, Logan," Jake called out with a grin, still washing his hands. "You think you can scare me like that? Not gonna happen." The lights flickered suddenly, the fluorescent bulbs buzzing overhead. Jake frowned, glancing at the mirror again. This time, he saw something, a shadow moving behind him, just out of the corner of his eye. He turned quickly, but the restroom was empty. Just as he was about to dismiss it as his imagination, all the faucets in the restroom suddenly burst to life, water gushing from every tap, filling the room with a cacophony of rushing water. Jake froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The lights flickered again, more violently this time, and in the mirror he saw him, the same man Logan had described. The figure stood behind Jake, his twisted grin wide, eyes hollow and dark, staring right at him through the mirror. Jake's breath caught in his throat, and before he could react, the lights went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. A long time passed, too long. Logan had finished replacing the sensor and was waiting anxiously in the hallway. The minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. Logan paced back and forth, his anxiety growing with every passing second. Finally, unable to take it any longer, he decided to go check on Jake. Logan's footsteps echoed ominously as he approached the restroom. He pushed open the door, the sound of dripping water greeting him. Inside, the restroom was dark, save for the dim emergency light above the sink. The air was heavy, thick with an oppressive silence. "Jake?" Logan called out, his voice trembling slightly. He took a step inside and froze. There, lying on the cold, wet floor, was Jake, unconscious. Panic surged through Logan as he rushed to Jake's side, kneeling down and shaking him gently. Jake, wake up!" Logan whispered urgently. Jake stirred, his eyes fluttering open as Logan sprinkled water on his face. He blinked, disoriented, his face pale. When he finally focused on Logan, his eyes were wide with terror. "Logan, get me out of here," Jake gasped, his voice barely above a whisper. Logan didn't need to be told twice. He helped Jake to his feet, supporting him as they hurried out of the restroom and back down the hallway. The elevator ride back to the control room was a blur, both of them breathing heavily, hearts racing. Once they were back in the relative safety of the control room, Jake slumped into a chair, his hands shaking as he recounted what had happened. He described the faucets turning on by themselves, the lights flickering, and the man in the mirror, the same man Logan had seen that night. Logan listened in stunned silence, his worst fears confirmed. They were not imagining things. Something truly malevolent was lurking in that building, specifically on the 13th floor. They spent the rest of the night in the control room, too terrified to leave. The monitors glowed softly around them, providing a faint sense of security, but neither of them could shake the feeling of dread that hung in the air. They stayed awake, vigilant, until the first light of dawn signaled the end of their shift. The next morning, exhausted but determined, Logan and Jake marched into Mr. Harris's office. They recounted the night's events in detail, their voices laced with fear and frustration. Mr. Harris listened intently, his expression growing more serious as they described the incidents on the 13th floor. When they finished, Mr. Harris leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful look on his face. "You mentioned that all these incidents happened on the 13th floor." Logan and Jake nodded, both of them too drained to speak further. Mr. Harris's eyes narrowed as he considered this. "That's interesting. The previous night shift engineer, the one before Logan, also had his encounter on the 13th floor. And then there's your experience, Logan, and now this. It seems to be centered around that floor." Jake spoke up, his voice firm despite the fear still gnawing at him. "Mr. Harris, we can't keep working here if this keeps happening. We're done. We want to resign." Logan nodded in agreement, too shaken to protest. Mr. Harris held up a hand, his expression earnest. "I understand your fear, and I don't want to put either of you in harm's way. But if this is indeed centered around the 13th floor, then perhaps there's something we can do. I propose this. We'll seal off the 13th floors in all 3 buildings, completely. We'll remove the buttons from the elevators, cut the power, and lock the access doors. The 13th floor will no longer exist for all intents and purposes." Logan and Jake exchanged glances, uncertain. Mr. Harris continued, his tone sincere. "If anything happens after that, if you still feel unsafe, I won't stop you from resigning. But give me one last chance to make this right." After a long, tense pause, Logan finally nodded. "All right, but if anything else happens, we're gone." Jake agreed, though the hesitation was clear in his voice. One last try. True to his word, the company moved quickly. The 13th floors were sealed off entirely. The elevator buttons for the 13th floor were removed. The lifts were programmed to skip the floor altogether. Access doors to the 13th floors were locked and bolted, and the power was cut, plunging those floors into darkness. It was as if the 13th floor had been erased from existence. After the floors were sealed, things seemed to settle down. Logan and Jake returned to their night shifts, and for a while, it seemed like the nightmare was finally over. The building was quieter, less oppressive, and they began to relax into their routine once more. But every so often, as they walked through the buildings on their rounds, a sense of unease would creep in. Sometimes, when they were fixing sensors on other floors, they would catch a glimpse of something, a fleeting shadow moving behind a window on the 13th floor, or a flicker of movement out of the corner of their eye. It was always subtle, always distant, and it never seemed to be a threat. Whatever haunted the 13th floor seemed to be contained, its influence waning now that the floor was sealed off. The incidents that had once terrorized them never happened again. Logan and Jake continued their work, but the shadows of the 13th floor lingered in their minds, a reminder of the darkness that still lurked just beyond reach. And though they never spoke of it, both men knew that the floor's darkness had never truly left them. It was just waiting, biding its time, hidden away in the sealed-off spaces of the building, a secret known only to those who had survived its horrors. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to subscribe to Vulnerable Screams for more spine-chilling content.
Next story.
Selena had just moved to Seattle for her bachelor's degree at the university. It was her first time living away from home, and the hostel was supposed to be a new beginning. The hostel itself was an old, creaky building with a history that the locals seemed to hush up whenever she asked about it. But the price was right, and it was close to campus. On this particular night, the rain hammered against the windows with relentless ferocity, drowning out most other sounds. Selena had decided to stay in, curling up on her bed with a classic horror movie. The bluish glow of the TV screen was the only source of light, casting eerie shadows across the room. She was halfway through the film when she heard a knock at her door. She paused the movie, heart already pounding from the suspenseful scenes, and listened. The knock came again, more insistent this time. She glanced at her phone. It was nearly midnight. Who could it be at this hour? Hesitant, she got up and tiptoed to the door. "Who is it?" she called out, her voice trembling slightly. No answer. She hesitated, then slowly unlocked the door and opened it a crack. The hallway outside was dimly lit, the old light fixtures flickering slightly. There was no one there. A cold draft swept past her, sending shivers down her spine. She stepped out into the hallway, looking left and right. Nothing. Shaking her head, she closed the door and locked it, trying to brush off the unease. As she turned back towards her bed, she heard it again, a knock, this time from the window. Her heart leapt into her throat. Slowly, she approached the window, her footsteps almost silent on the wooden floor. She drew back the curtain and gasped. A pale, ghostly face stared back at her, eyes wide and unblinking. Selena stumbled back, nearly tripping over her own feet. When she dared to look again, the face was gone. She closed the curtain quickly, breathing heavily, and backed away from the window. Her phone buzzed, startling her. It was a text from an unknown number. "You shouldn't have ignored me." Her fingers trembled as she tried to call her friend Mia, but the call wouldn't go through, no signal. Panic set in as she felt increasingly isolated. She checked the door again, making sure it was locked, and then went to her closet to grab something she could use as a weapon. The only thing she found was a heavy metal flashlight. Clutching it tightly, she tried to steady her breathing. The knocking resumed, this time from the door again, but it was different, more forceful, almost angry. "Selena, let me in," a voice hissed from the other side. It was a voice she didn't recognize, low and menacing. She backed away from the door, heart racing. The doorknob rattled as whoever it was tried to force their way in. Desperate, Selena ran to the bathroom and locked herself inside. She crouched down in the bathtub, flashlight clutched to her chest, and tried to stay silent. Her mind raced through the possibilities. Who could it be? Why were they after her? The banging on the door grew louder, more frantic. She could hear the wood starting to splinter. Tears streamed down her face as she realized how helpless she was. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The silence was deafening. Minutes passed, feeling like hours. She remained in the bathtub, too terrified to move. Finally, she heard footsteps retreating down the hallway. She waited, counting to 100 in her head, before daring to emerge. The door was still intact, though badly damaged. She listened at the door, hearing nothing but the rain outside. Gathering her courage, she slowly opened the door and peered out. The hallway was empty, but she noticed something odd, a trail of wet footprints leading down the corridor. She followed them cautiously, her flashlight beam flickering on the wet floor. The prints led to another room at the end of the hall, room 213, which she knew had been vacant for months. The door to room 213 was ajar, creaking slightly as it moved. She nudged it open with a flashlight, illuminating the dark room inside. It was empty, but the window was open, rain blowing in and soaking the floor. She approached the window and looked out, seeing nothing but the stormy night. Just as she turned to leave, she noticed something on the floor, a small, folded piece of paper. She picked it up, hand shaking, and unfolded it. Written in smeared ink were the words, "You can't hide forever." A sob escaped her lips as she crumpled the note. She had to get out of there, find help. She hurried back to her room, grabbed her phone and keys, and headed for the stairs. As she descended, she heard footsteps above her. Someone was following her. She quickened her pace, almost slipping on the wet steps. Reaching the lobby, she burst through the door and into the night, the rain immediately drenching her. She ran across the courtyard to the security office, pounding on the door. The guard, an older man named Frank, opened it, looking concerned. "Selena, what's wrong?" he asked, eyes wide. "Someone's after me," she gasped. "They were in the hostel, trying to get into my room." Frank nodded, grabbing his flashlight and a walkie-talkie. "Stay here," he instructed. "I'll go check it out." Selena watched as he hurried back into the building, leaving her alone in the small office. She tried calling me again, but still no signal. Minutes passed, and she grew increasingly anxious. Finally, the walkie-talkie on the desk crackled to life. "Selena," Frank's voice came through, but it sounded distorted. "I found something. You need to see this." Fear gripping her, Selena picked up the walkie-talkie. "What is it?" There was a long pause, then, "Come to the basement." Her heart sank. The basement was the creepiest part of the hostel, a labyrinth of old storage rooms and boiler rooms. But she had no choice. She needed answers. She grabbed the walkie-talkie and flashlight, and made her way to the basement door. The stairs creaked ominously as she descended, the air growing colder and more damp. Her flashlight flickered, casting long shadows on the walls. She reached the bottom and called out, "Frank?" No response. She moved through the narrow corridors, the silence pressing in on her. Then, up ahead, she saw a figure slumped against the wall. It was Frank. She rushed to his side, shaking him. He was unconscious, a large bruise on his head. Next to him was another note, stained with blood. Too late. Selena's blood ran cold. She looked around, realizing she was not alone. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up as she sensed movement behind her. She turned slowly, flashlight beams sweeping the dark hallway. A shadow darted out of sight, and she heard a faint, mocking laugh. She backed away, trying to drag Frank with her, but he was too heavy. Panic set in as she realized how trapped she was. Then she remembered the boiler room. It had a second exit. She abandoned the walkie-talkie and flashlight, opting for stealth, and crept through the darkened basement. The door to the boiler room creaked open, and she slipped inside. The oppressive heat and noise from the boilers were almost comforting compared to the silence outside. She made her way to the far end, where the emergency exit was. As she reached for the handle, she heard footsteps behind her. She spun around, eyes wide with fear. Standing in the doorway was a tall figure, face obscured by a hood. "You can't escape," the figure said, voice cold and devoid of emotion. Selena backed away, heart pounding. "Why are you doing this?" she cried. The figure stepped closer, and in the dim light, she saw a glint of metal, a knife. "Because it's fun," the figure replied, lifting the knife menacingly. Desperate, Selena grabbed a nearby wrench and swung it with all her strength. The figure stumbled, but recovered quickly, slashing at her. She felt a sharp pain in her arm and screamed, dropping the wrench. Blood flowed from the wound, but adrenaline kept her moving. She turned and bolted for the exit, throwing the door open and fleeing into the stormy night. She didn't stop running until she reached the main road, drenched and bleeding. She flagged down a passing car, and the driver, seeing her distress, called the police. The authorities arrived quickly, but by the time they searched the hostel, the attacker was gone. They found Frank, injured but alive, and took Selena to the hospital. As she sat in the emergency room, waiting to be stitched up, she couldn't shake the feeling of dread. The words on the notes echoed in her mind, "You can't hide forever." Days passed, and the police investigation turned up little evidence. Selena was moved to a new hostel with better security, but the trauma lingered. She couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on her studies. Every shadow, every creak of the building set her on edge. Then, one night, as she lay in her new room, trying to calm her racing thoughts, her phone buzzed with a new message from an unknown number. "I'm watching you." She froze, blood running cold. Her nightmare was far from over. Selena's heart pounded as she stared at the message on her phone. She felt trapped in a never-ending nightmare. She showed the message to the police, but with no solid leads or evidence, there was little they could do. The attacker remained a ghost, slipping through the cracks of their investigation. She tried to go about her daily life, but the constant fear gnawed at her. Her new hostel was supposed to be safer, but now every sound, every shadow seemed like a potential threat. Her friends and family worried about her, urging her to come home, but she was determined not to let fear dictate her life. One evening, Selena decided to take a walk to clear her mind. The hostel grounds were quiet, the usual chatter of students replaced by the soothing rustle of leaves in the breeze. She walked to a small park nearby, trying to lose herself in the serenity. As she sat on a bench, watching the sun set, she felt a sense of calm for the first time in weeks. But that calm was shattered when she noticed someone standing in the shadows, watching her. Panic gripped her, but she forced herself to stay composed. She stood up and started walking back towards the hostel, quickening her pace as she heard footsteps behind her. She glanced over her shoulder and saw the same hooded figure from the basement, moving swiftly towards her. Selena broke into a run, her heart pounding in her ears. She sprinted through the park, weaving between trees and benches, trying to lose her pursuer. She could hear the figure gaining on her, the sound of his footsteps growing louder. She stumbled onto the main road, nearly colliding with a car. The driver honked and swerved, shouting obscenities, but she didn't stop. She burst into the hostel lobby, gasping for breath, and slammed the door shut behind her. The security guard on duty, a young man named Jason, looked up in surprise. "Selena, what's wrong?" he asked, rushing over to her. "He's here," she managed to say between breaths. "The person who's been stalking me, he's outside." Jason immediately called the police and escorted Selena to the security room, where they watched the CCTV footage. The cameras had caught the hooded figure following her through the park, but the person had disappeared just before she entered the hostel. Selena's heart sank. The figure was out there, waiting. The police arrived quickly and searched the area, but again found nothing. They promised to increase patrols around the hostel and urged Selena to stay inside as much as possible. But she knew that as long as her stalker was out there, she would never feel safe. That night, Selena couldn't sleep. Every creak of the building, every gust of wind against the windows set her on edge. She decided to keep a journal, writing down everything that had happened, hoping it might help the police piece together some clues. Weeks turned into months, and the stalker seemed to vanish. There were no more messages, no sightings. Selena began to relax, thinking maybe it was finally over. She even started to focus on her studies again, regaining a semblance of normalcy. One rainy night, almost a year after the ordeal began, Selena was in her room, finishing an assignment. The hostel was quiet, most students away for the weekend. She stretched and got up to get a glass of water from the kitchen. As she walked down the dark hallway, she noticed a door slightly ajar. Curiosity and dread filled her as she approached the door. She pushed it open and peered inside. The room was empty, but on the floor was a familiar sight, a folded piece of paper. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. The message was clear: "Welcome back." A chill ran down her spine. She backed out of the room, only to bump into someone behind her. She spun around, and there stood the hooded figure, blocking her path. She screamed and tried to run, but the figure grabbed her, dragging her back into the room. She struggled, kicking and screaming, but the figure was too strong. He threw her to the floor, and she scrambled to her feet, backing into a corner. The figure approached slowly, the knife glinting in his hand. "Why are you doing this?" she cried, tears streaming down her face. The figure lowered the hood, revealing a face she recognized. It was a fellow student, someone she had seen around the campus but never really known. "Because you were supposed to be mine," he said, voice cold and detached. "But you ignored me, so I had to make you notice." Selena's mind raced, trying to make sense of the madness. She glanced around the room, looking for anything she could use as a weapon. The figure lunged at her, and she grabbed a heavy lamp from the bedside table, swinging it with all her might. It connected with the figure's head, and he stumbled back, dazed. She seized the opportunity and ran for the door, but he recovered quickly, grabbing her ankle and pulling her to the ground. She kicked and screamed, desperate to escape. Just as the figure raised the knife, the door burst open, and Jason, the security guard, tackled the attacker to the floor. The police arrived moments later, arresting the stalker and taking him away. Selena was shaken but grateful to be alive. She thanked Jason, who had heard her screams and come to her rescue just in time. In the days that followed, Selena learned more about her stalker. He had become obsessed with her after seeing her around campus and had meticulously planned the terror campaign to make her notice him. The police found a twisted shrine in his dorm room, filled with photos and mementos of Selena. She slowly began to rebuild her life, but the scars of the ordeal remained. She was more cautious, more aware of her surroundings, but she refused to let fear control her. Months later, as she walked across the campus, she felt a sense of empowerment. She had faced her worst nightmare and survived. She was determined to live her life to the fullest, no longer a victim but a survivor. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind howled outside and the shadows seemed to move on their own, she couldn't help but wonder if she was truly safe. And in those moments, she would remember the words of the final note, "You can't hide forever." If you enjoyed Selena's harrowing journey through fear and survival, be sure to subscribe to Vulnerable Screams for more spine-chilling stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat.
Next story.
Luna had been looking forward to this camping trip for weeks. She and her friends had planned everything meticulously. The remote campsite, nestled deep within the woods, promised a weekend of adventure, laughter, and relaxation. As the group set up their tents under the canopy of towering trees, the air was filled with the sounds of nature and their excited chatter. The first day was perfect. They hiked through scenic trails, swam in the crystal-clear lake, and roasted marshmallows over a crackling campfire. As the sun set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Luna felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. But as darkness fell, the atmosphere began to shift subtly. The group gathered around the fire, sharing stories and laughter. Luna's best friend, Sarah, suggested they tell ghost stories. Everyone agreed, and soon the air was filled with tales of haunted houses and supernatural encounters. Luna felt a chill run down her spine as the stories became increasingly eerie, but she laughed it off, attributing it to the cool night air. As the fire died down, the group decided to turn in for the night. Luna crawled into her tent, feeling the exhaustion of the day's activities settling in. She fell asleep quickly, but her rest was short-lived. She was jolted awake by a faint, unfamiliar sound. It was a soft rustling, like someone or something was moving just outside her tent. Her heart pounded in her chest as she strained to listen. The sound grew louder, more distinct. She glanced at her phone. 2:15 a.m. Luna tried to convince herself it was just an animal, but the fear gnawing at her gut told her otherwise. Gathering her courage, she unzipped the tent slowly, peeking out into the darkness. The moonlight cast eerie shadows on the forest floor, and for a moment, Luna saw nothing out of the ordinary. But then, a figure moved at the edge of the clearing, disappearing into the trees. Luna's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't make out any details, but the figure was unmistakably human. Panicked, Luna scrambled back into her tent and zipped it shut. She listened intently, but the rustling had stopped. After what felt like an eternity, she convinced herself it was just one of her friends playing a prank. Still, sleep eluded her for the rest of the night. The next morning, Luna was the first to wake. She emerged from her tent, bleary-eyed and still on edge. The others soon followed, yawning and stretching, oblivious to her unease. She considered telling them about the figure but decided against it, not wanting to ruin the trip with her paranoia. They spent the day exploring more trails and fishing in the lake. Despite her best efforts to relax, Luna couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig set her nerves on edge. She kept glancing over her shoulder, but nothing seemed out of place. As dusk settled once again, Luna's anxiety grew. She suggested they keep the campfire burning all night, citing the cold as an excuse. her friends agreed, and the fire's warm glow provided a semblance of comfort. But as the hours passed, Luna's fear intensified. She was dozing off in her camp chair when a blood-curdling scream pierced the night. Luna jolted awake, heart racing. The scream had come from Sarah's tent. Luna and the others rushed over, finding Sarah thrashing and screaming, tangled in her sleeping bag. "It was just a nightmare," Sarah said shakily once she had calmed down, but the terror in her eyes told a different story. Luna's unease deepened. The figure from the previous night flashed in her mind. Was it a coincidence, or was something more sinister at play? The group returned to their tents, but Luna stayed awake, her senses on high alert. Around 3 a.m., she heard it again, the rustling. This time, it was closer, circling their campsite. Luna's pulse quickened. She wanted to wake the others, but fear paralyzed her. She lay still, barely breathing, as the sound moved around the tents. Suddenly, the rustling stopped. There was a long, eerie silence, and then a soft whisper, unintelligible but undeniably human, filled the air. Luna's blood ran cold. She clamped her hand over her mouth to stifle a scream. The whispering continued, growing louder, more insistent. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Just as abruptly as it started, the whispering ceased. Luna lay frozen, waiting for what felt like hours before daring to move. She knew she had to tell the others, but she couldn't bring herself to leave the tent. Exhausted and terrified, she eventually fell into a restless sleep. When morning came, Luna told her friends everything. At first, they were skeptical, but Sarah's nightmare and Luna's palpable fear convinced them something was wrong. They decided to stick together for the day and stay vigilant. The day passed uneventfully, but the group's nerves were frayed. As night fell, they made sure the fire was large and bright. No one wanted to sleep, so they took turns keeping watch. Luna volunteered for the first shift, determined to stay awake and alert. Hours passed with no incident, and Luna began to relax. Maybe it was just her imagination running wild. But then she saw the figure, standing at the edge of the clearing, watching them. Luna's heart pounded as she strained to see more clearly. The figure was tall, its features obscured by shadows. "Luna, are you okay?" Sarah's voice broke the silence, and Luna turned to see her friend emerging from the tent. When she looked back, the figure was gone. Luna rubbed her eyes, wondering if she was losing her mind. She and Sarah sat by the fire, talking in hushed tones. Sarah tried to reassure her, but Luna couldn't shake the feeling of impending doom. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the woods, followed by the sound of footsteps running towards them. The group huddled together, eyes wide with fear. The footsteps stopped just beyond the firelight, and for a moment, all was silent. Then, a deep, guttural growl broke the stillness. Luna's blood turned to ice. It sounded close, too close. Without warning, the figure lunged into the clearing, a shadowy blur of movement. The group scattered, screaming. Luna ran blindly into the woods, branches tearing at her clothes and skin. She could hear her friends' panicked cries, but they seemed to come from all directions. Luna's lungs burned as she ran, her heart pounding in her ears. She tripped over a root and fell hard, the impact knocking the wind out of her. Gasping for breath, she scrambled to her feet, eyes darting around the dark forest. The figure was nowhere in sight, but she knew it was out there, hunting them. Desperate and disoriented, Luna stumbled through the woods, trying to find her way back to the campsite. She could hear rustling nearby, the sound of footsteps stalking her. Panic surged through her veins, and she broke into a run, adrenaline fueling her flight. Suddenly, she burst into a small clearing. Moonlight illuminated the area, revealing an old, abandoned cabin. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, but it was her only hope. She sprinted to the door, flinging it open and slamming it shut behind her. The cabin was dark and musty, filled with cobwebs and decaying furniture. Luna searched for something to barricade the door. Finding an old chair, she wedged under the handle. She backed away, trying to catch her breath, her eyes scanning the room for any other signs of danger. She found a small window and peeked out, her heart sinking when she saw the figure standing at the edge of the clearing, watching the cabin. It didn't move, just stood there, a silent sentinel. Luna shuddered, stepping away from the window. She explored the cabin, hoping to find something, anything that could help her. In a corner, she found an old, rusted hunting knife. It wasn't much, but it made her feel slightly less defenseless. She gripped it tightly, her knuckles white with fear. Hours passed, and the figure remained outside. Luna's mind raced with questions. Who was this person? What did they want? And why were they tormenting her and her friends? The silence was oppressive, the tension unbearable. Just as dawn began to break, Luna heard a noise behind her. She spun around, knife raised, to see Sarah standing in the doorway, her eyes wide with fear. "Luna, we need to get out of here," she whispered urgently. Relief washed over Luna, and she ran to her friend, embracing her tightly. "How did you find me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I heard you scream and followed your voice," Sarah replied, glancing nervously at the window. "We need to go now, before it comes back." Together, they carefully exited the cabin, moving as quietly as possible. The figure was gone, but Luna knew it was only a matter of time before it returned. They made their way through the woods, trying to retrace their steps back to the campsite. As they walked, Luna shared what she had experienced. Sarah listened, her expression grim. "We need to find the others and get out of here," she said. "Something isn't right about this place." The woods seemed darker, more menacing as they made their way back. Every sound, every shadow set Luna's nerves on edge. They finally reached the campsite, finding it in disarray. Tents were slashed, belongings scattered. There was no sign of their friends. Panic threatened to overwhelm Luna, but Sarah grabbed her shoulders, forcing her to focus. "We have to keep moving," she said firmly. "We'll find them, but we can't stay here." As they turned to leave, they heard a low growl, the same one from the night before. Luna's blood ran cold. The figure emerged from the trees, moving slowly towards them. It was closer now, and Luna could make out more details. The figure was tall and gaunt, its face hidden by a hood. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and its skin was an unnatural, mottled grey. Luna and Sarah backed away, their hearts pounding. The figure advanced, its movements deliberate and menacing. "Run!" Sarah shouted, and they sprinted into the woods, the figure in pursuit. They ran blindly, crashing through the underbrush. Luna's lungs burned, her legs felt like lead, but she pushed herself to keep going. The figure was relentless, always just a few steps behind. They burst into another clearing, this one dominated by a massive, gnarled tree. Luna tripped and fell, the knife slipping from her grasp. Sarah helped her up, but it was too late. The figure was upon them. It lunged at Luna, and she screamed, bracing for impact. But then, a blinding light filled the clearing, and the figure recoiled, hissing in pain. Luna shielded her eyes, squinting against the light. It was coming from a group of people, dressed in strange, ceremonial robes. They chanted in a language Luna didn't recognize, and the figure shrieked, retreating into the shadows. The leader of the group stepped forward, a tall woman with piercing eyes. "You need to leave this place," she said urgently. "It is cursed, and you are not safe here." Luna and Sarah, too exhausted and terrified to question, nodded. The group led them through the woods, the chanting keeping the figure at bay. As they walked, the leader explained that the forest was home to an ancient, malevolent spirit that preyed on unsuspecting campers. The figure they had seen was its manifestation, a dark echo of those it had claimed before. They finally reached the edge of the forest as dawn broke. The group urged Luna and Sarah to leave and never return. The leader handed Luna a small amulet. "This will protect you," she said. "Keep it close, and the spirit cannot harm you." Luna and Sarah thanked them, too shaken to fully comprehend what had happened. They made their way back to their car, finding it miraculously untouched. As they drove away, Luna glanced back at the forest, a shiver running down her spine. They never found their friends. The authorities searched the woods but found no trace of them. Luna and Sarah were left with haunting memories and a sense of profound loss. They never spoke of the trip again, but the events of those 2 nights stayed with them, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurked just beyond the light. Years later, Luna still wore the amulet, never forgetting the terror she had faced. She had learned to live with the fear, but sometimes, in the dead of night, she would wake to the sound of rustling leaves and a whisper that seemed to come from nowhere. She would clutch the amulet tightly and pray that the spirit remained bound to the cursed woods, far from her and those she loved. Thank you for joining us on this terrifying journey. If Luna's harrowing tale kept you on the edge of your seat and you crave more spine-chilling stories, consider subscribing for more chilling content. Remember, the woods may seem peaceful and inviting, but as Luna learned, not everything is as it seems. Always trust your instincts, stay vigilant, and never ignore the whispers in the dark.
Next story.
Emily had always dreamed of a quiet life away from the noise and chaos of the city. When she found a small, picturesque town nestled deep in the mountains, she thought she had found her sanctuary. The town of Ashford was known for its serene beauty and the towering pine trees that surrounded it like sentinels. Emily quickly fell in love with the old cabin she purchased at the edge of the forest, its rustic charm and isolation offering her the peace she desperately craved. For the first few weeks, life in Ashford was everything she had hoped for. The townspeople were welcoming, the air was crisp and clean, and the sound of the wind whispering through the pines was soothing. She spent her days renovating the cabin and her evenings by the fireplace, finally feeling at ease. But one evening, as she was settling into bed, Emily heard something that made her heart skip a beat. It was a soft, almost imperceptible tapping at her window. She dismissed it as a branch swaying in the wind and tried to ignore the uneasy feeling that gnawed at her. The next morning, she found something strange on her front porch, a small, intricately folded paper crane. It was delicate, made from parchment that looked old and yellowed with age. There was no note, no indication of who might have left it. Puzzled, Emily placed it on her mantel and continued with her day. However, the following morning brought another crane, identical to the first. This time, it was perched on her windowsill. A cold shiver ran down her spine, but she tried to convince herself it was just a harmless prank. Days turned into weeks, and the cranes kept coming, each one appearing closer to her home, on her doorstep, the porch swing, the handle of her front door. Emily's unease grew with every new discovery. Who was leaving them, and why? Then, one night, the tapping returned, louder this time. Emily cautiously approached the window, but when she pulled back the curtain, there was nothing, only the dark outline of the forest. Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Determined to uncover the truth, Emily decided to stay awake the next night and catch the person responsible. Armed with a flashlight and her phone, she sat in the dark, her eyes fixed on the windows. Hours passed, and just as she was about to give up, she heard it, a faint rustling outside. Emily's heart pounded as she crept toward the door. She flung it open, shining her flashlight into the darkness. The beam caught the glint of something small on the ground, another crane. But this time, there was something else, a whisper, so soft she almost missed it. "Help me," the voice was barely audible, carried on the wind. Terrified, Emily called out into the night, but there was no response. She slammed the door shut, her hands trembling. Was someone playing a cruel joke, or was there something more sinister at play? The following day, she visited the local library, hoping to find some history about the town and perhaps a clue to her mysterious visitor. The librarian, an elderly woman with kind eyes, hesitated when Emily mentioned the paper cranes. "There's an old legend," she began cautiously, "about a girl named Lily who lived in a cabin just like yours, nearly a century ago. They say she disappeared into the woods one night and was never seen again. But some claim her spirit lingers, trying to find her way back home." Emily felt a chill run through her. Could it be that these cranes were some kind of message from beyond? She returned to her cabin, the librarian's words echoing in her mind. That night, as she lay in bed, she heard the tapping again, followed by the faint whisper, "Help me." Unable to bear the suspense any longer, Emily decided to confront whatever or whoever was haunting her. She grabbed her coat and flashlight and stepped out into the night. The forest was eerily silent, the towering pines casting long, dark shadows. She followed the whispers, her breath visible in the cold night air. The sound led her deeper into the woods, where the trees grew denser and the light of her cabin was no longer visible. Emily felt a surge of fear but pressed on, driven by a strange compulsion to uncover the truth. Finally, she reached a small clearing. In the center stood an ancient, crumbling well, half hidden by overgrown ivy. As Emily approached, she noticed something fluttering at the edge, another crane. She picked it up, and as she did, a gust of wind whipped through the clearing, carrying the soft voice once more. "Find me," it whispered. Emily shone her flashlight into the well, her heart pounding. At first, she saw nothing but darkness. But then, a faint glimmer caught her eye, a piece of white cloth snagged on the rough stones, deep inside the well. Her breath hitched as the realization hit her. With trembling hands, she called the police. The search was long and harrowing, but eventually they uncovered the remains of a young girl, hidden deep within the well. The town was in shock. Lily's disappearance had been a mystery for decades. The discovery brought a sense of closure to the town and to Emily. The cranes stopped appearing after that night, and the whispering in the pines faded away. But Emily knew she would never forget the fear that had gripped her, or the tragic story of the girl who had sought her help from beyond the grave. Though life in Ashford eventually returned to its peaceful routine, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the woods were still watching, their ancient trees holding secrets that would never be fully uncovered. As she locked her door each night, she would glance at the mantel where the last crane sat, a silent reminder of the night she discovered that not all whispers are meant to be heard. If you enjoyed this story and want more spine-chilling tales, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Until next time, stay safe and keep your eyes open. The shadows are always watching.